Hi, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Now, just to get this out of the way, because every stream has to begin like this, let's just make sure that everything's working. Let's just make sure that the microphone is working, that the stream has started, that you can hear my voice. And once we're sure that everything is operating the way it ought to, then we can really properly get the show started. There's the chat. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? That's the first question. Don't joke around and say there's an echo. That's the second question. The first question is, can you hear me? The second question is the audio quality okay? It's never great. It's never as good as it is in the videos, but just out of curiosity, since you can hear it and I can't, does everything sound all right? You have the bulletin board on your screen? Outstanding. Hey, Yazik. Okay, guys. Well, for those of you who are watching and listening, who are tuned into this stream, you're watching something special because this has never been done on this channel before. This idea has been kicked around for quite some time, but this has never been done before. What you're going to see is the latest video that was produced for this channel. It's about privilege. So watching it, when it starts playing, it will be as if you're watching a video that was published on the channel. The only difference is it's being streamed. And when the video is over, I'll come back and turn to the chat, and then we can talk about it. We'll primarily focus on the video and all the things that happen in it, but of course we can also just talk about the subject in general, in case you have something to say that isn't directly related to the video. So, now that you all understand, this is a long video, by the way. It's about 20 minutes long. This was a real handful, but hopefully nobody gets bored watching this. I don't think you will. This is kind of a hot topic. So now that you understand the structure, we're going to stream this video, and then afterwards we're going to talk about it. So, and while the video is playing, I will be responding to as many comments in the chat as I can, not audibly. I'll just be chatting away in the chat room with you, and then when the video's over, we'll talk about it. You guys ready? Are you ready? Wonderful. Without further ado, let's begin. Thanks again for tuning in. The concept of privilege, as it relates to a person's identity, is one of the most difficult subjects to discuss productively. Why? What is the problem with this particular debate? Well, perhaps it's this. Ordinarily, a healthy debate about any subject would stay focused on the subject matter itself, on the merits of the arguments themselves, and would never, ever become personal. However, a discussion about privilege will inevitably become personal because the personal background of those having the discussion is the subject matter. No wonder, then, it's such a precarious concept to entertain. This, in spite of the fact that it's actually a simple theory. The definition of privilege is a right or immunity granted as a peculiar benefit, advantage, or favor. According to the theory of privilege, privileges are not earned, but inherited through the good fortune of an individual's birth. Some people inherit many privileges, and other people inherit few privileges. It's a theory, and a fascinating one at least. After all, everyone is born into a different environment, a series of circumstances that they are not responsible for. There's a common experiment that's conducted to illustrate this. A diverse group of individuals are lined up side by side and are then given cues such as, if you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you've ever been diagnosed with a physical disability or a mental illness, take one step back, and the results are unsurprising. Some individuals are near the front of the room, and others are near the rear. So the central claim of this theory is not a controversial one. Some people are less fortunate than others through no fault of their own. and this establishes the bare bones criteria for a privilege, a characteristic or circumstance which A, presents advantages that are B, not earned, and C, are invisible to those who have them, which is a figurative way of saying that a person who has had a particular advantage their entire life does not know what life is like without that advantage. Simple enough. Those circumstances, those aspects of a person's life, are what's labeled privileges. These include, but cannot possibly be limited to, being white, being male, being straight or heterosexual, being able-bodied, wealthy or upper class, being educated, being tall, an American citizen, mentally healthy, stereotypically beautiful, having 2 married parents, being a Christian, young, having been well-raised as a child, speaking English, being skinny or thin, cisgender, and living in a country or any other setting in which there is no war. All of these circumstances and characteristics, so the argument goes, are privileges. Each one allegedly gives an individual a better likelihood that they will realize their full potential and make the most of their life. One thing that you might have noticed about these characteristics is that they don't have very much in common with one another. Race, class, attractiveness, parental guidance, height. These are all remarkably different ways of assessing a person's privilege or lack thereof. So let's start simple and analyze an obvious example. Wealth privilege. Money presents you with more options and opportunities in life. The more of it that you have, money also sustains a high quality of life, good schools, healthy food, safe communities, and the ability to travel. So if somebody was born into a wealthy family, that could safely be described as a privilege. Another example here that easily fits the standards might be the privilege of having an intact family, having 2 parents who are married to one another. According to numerous studies, children whose parents have gotten divorced are statistically less likely to be physically or emotionally healthy, more likely to drop out of high school, work lower-paying jobs, become addicted to drugs and alcohol, not to mention twice as likely to attempt suicide, and 300% more likely to require psychological help. Empirically, having an intact family is a privilege. The same could be said of being able to use your entire body, the privilege of being mentally healthy, the privilege of being well-raised, and the privilege of living in a state of peace, far removed from a war zone or any other military conflict. All of these circumstances satisfy the criteria. They grant advantages, which are unearned, and they are, according to the theory, invisible, which, again, is just a figurative way of saying that if you've always been wealthy, you don't know what it's like to be poor. If you're able-bodied, you don't know what it's like being unable to use your hands or your legs. If your family is intact, you don't know how it feels to live in a broken home, but if you do lack any of these privileges, you do know what it's like. All in all, the theory itself seems to make a fair observation. And so far, the examples that we've checked off fit very well into the framework of the theory. But if we take a look at some of the others here, we might not find that to be the case. One such characteristic would be tall privilege, a characteristic which is naturally unearned, but the benefits that come with being tall are conditional. Being tall is an advantage when grabbing something hard to reach. It is not an advantage when flying coach. There's also something to be said about height as it relates to dating, and by extension, natural selection. Studies have shown that a majority of heterosexual women prefer a man who is taller than they are, and heterosexual men as well generally prefer a woman who is shorter than they are. That makes being tall a privilege for men, but not so much a privilege for women in the context of dating. What difference does it make, one might ask, if a privilege is only a privilege conditionally? So what? Well, to answer that, it allows us to question part of this theory, that a privilege renders advantages. If a tall person, for example, is fortunate to be tall under certain conditions and unfortunate to be tall under other conditions, describing that characteristic simply as a privilege would seem to be biased. It would only acknowledge the advantages, and it would ignore the disadvantages. A great example of this would be American privilege. There are many aspects of American life which are better by comparison to life in other countries. However, there are other aspects of American life which are worse by comparison. But what really makes this trait a giant mess is that it is extremely debatable which ones are which. For example, many would argue that the right to bear arms is a positive aspect of American life, while others would argue that it is in fact a negative aspect. And this is just one example, one of many, many, many others. There are uncontroversial benefits that come with being an American, but because the theory of privilege is only concerned with advantages, it might not be the best way to understand a trait in which there are advantages and disadvantages. It might also call into question the second standard, that a privilege is unearned. That's not always the case with something like citizenship. Most Americans were born in the United States. Their citizenship was not earned. Some Americans, however, immigrated from another country. Their citizenship was earned. Are they, according to the theory, privileged to be an American? A similar question could be asked regarding thin people. Some people naturally stay thin due to their genetic makeup, God bless them, but other people can only stay thin if they diet and exercise. Those people work hard to maintain a thin body, in which case, according to the theory, they are not necessarily privileged to be thin. Even the privilege of having an education could be questioned on these grounds. Having access to an education is a privilege, but completing an education is a personal achievement, or at least it should be, as well as the grades that a student makes. So again, it seems like some of this is conditional. Not all of these characteristics are inherent all of the time. Some of them can be achieved. Body size, grade point average, citizenship, spoken language, religion, physical attractiveness to an extent, and even wealth. These things either can or must be obtained by someone who doesn't already have them. At this point, we could question the third standard as well, the invisibility of privilege. The notion of privilege being invisible makes sense, but only if you've had such a privilege for your entire life. Suppose you haven't. Suppose somebody was not always thin, or educated, or beautiful. Suppose somebody escapes a war-torn country and flees to another country that's in a state of peace. It's probably not fair to assume that the benefits of peace are invisible to that person because they have personally experienced life without those benefits. Each characteristic here entails different advantages under specific conditions to a varying degree of probability. Some of them render disadvantages, some of them can be earned, and the benefits entailed are not invisible to everyone who has them. Not to mention the fact that you can't tell most of this stuff about a person just by looking at them. Some, however, you can tell just by looking at them, and up until now, you've probably been waiting for the elephant or elephants in the room to be acknowledged. By far, the two most contested and publicized privileges of them all, male privilege and white privilege. These two, let's call them genres of privilege, are notoriously difficult to discuss productively, with white privilege perhaps being the slipperiest of them all.
Let me repeat this, and I'll do it slowly.
All right.
So even you can understand.
All right.
If you work hard, if you get educated, if you're an honest person, you can make it in America.
If you live in a neighborhood where poverty is endemic, it's harder to work hard.
It's
harder to get an education.
Hey, it was harder for me than it was for the white guy in Garden City. It's all relative. Yes, it's harder if you're a ghetto kid. Yes. But can you do it? Yes.
Yes, you can. You can also win the 100-yard dash on one leg, but it's harder.
One reason for this, as was mentioned earlier, is that it's hard to have any conversation that becomes personal. But it also doesn't help that when people try to explain white privilege, they usually do so in a very fuzzy and uninformative way.
Does white privilege exist?
Absolutely.
It does.
Absolutely.
And where's the proof of that?
All around. Give me some hints as to my white privilege.
You know, it's about role and it's about access, and what you can do is extend that privilege so that you can dismantle it, right? So you can create opportunity for people, you can amplify issues in ways that other people can't, and you can use your resources to create space for people.
It's basically a ticket to anything that everybody else is excluded from because of your skin color.
The truth is that white privilege doesn't act according to quantifiable segments. It's about the degree to which we are willing as a society to grapple with the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality upon which it's based.
White people were raised to think of ourselves as good people. And
we are good people.
And there is a moral thorn if you hear that you have had some things in your life that you didn't deserve, you didn't earn, but they came to you. So we're quite fragile on the subject, and whites are often defensive.
So where is the best place to begin in trying to understand this? When we were looking at these other types of privileges, you probably noticed a theme. It's all a matter of averages. Being healthy, being wealthy, being educated and good-looking, having an intact family, etc., all of these things render a higher likelihood of a fulfilling life. They don't guarantee it, they simply make the odds better. So, can we apply that premise to being white? Does being born white make a good life more likely? Let's be empirical about this and find out. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, from 2010 to 2014, white Americans represented the lowest percentage of students in high-poverty public schools. According to the Economic Policy Institute, the percentage of black people who are unemployed is higher than the percentage of white people, regardless of the level of education. According to Pew Research Center, whites are more likely to be born into an intact family, graduate high school, have a degree, own a house, live above the poverty line, and earn a higher household income, all relative to blacks, at least in the United States. What does all of this mean? It means that we have an abstract argument. A white newborn baby is, on average, more likely to be born to two married parents who are educated, own a house, and are not in poverty. In short, a white newborn baby is more likely to be born into a good environment. And being born into a good environment simply means that you are more likely to achieve a fulfilling life. This observation fits the framework of the theory. Being born into certain circumstances makes certain outcomes statistically more likely. The same holds true for male privilege, albeit being a man relative to a woman is notably grayer. On average, men are physically larger and stronger, earn a higher salary, are more likely to be a billionaire, a CEO, a politician, a business owner, and are less likely to be the victim of sexual assault relative to women. Men are also more likely to be killed at work or in war, lose custody of their children, wind up homeless, live a shorter life, and be a victim of aggravated assault relative to women, just to name very few examples. So the privilege of being a male American is a lot more conditional than the privilege of being a white American, but the general notion that being born a certain way makes certain outcomes more likely still appears to be a fair observation. So maybe the problem with this theory isn't the theory itself, but rather the way in which it is often applied. Privilege is often not approached abstractly, but rather concretely. The notion that success is more likely with privilege is bastardized into the assumption that success requires privilege. Now, what could possibly go wrong when that assumption is made? Suppose you have a conversation with a successful man without knowing his skin color. You might assume that the person you're talking to is white because white people are more likely to be successful relative to black people, and that would be an assumption. As with any assumption, it might be wrong.
I've chosen to cross different parts of the media world, done the work so that I'm qualified to be in each one. I never considered my color the issue. I considered my qualifications the issue.
Well, David, you know, that's a whole nother long conversation about white privilege and things that you have the privilege of doing that people of color don't have the privilege of.
How do I have the privilege of white privilege?
David, by virtue of being a white male, you have white privilege. This whole long conversation, I don't have time to get into it.
Ariva, I hate to break it to you, but you should have been better prepped. I'm black.
Okay, then I stand.
See, you went to white privilege. This is the falsehood in this. You went immediately with an assumption.
David,
that's actually
David,
insulting.
It is, and I apologize because my people gave me wrong information.
Who gives you the wrong information that I'm white to come on my radio show? Think about that for a minute.
What did she say, her team? What was the bad information?
They gave her the wrong information. So
what does that mean?
Well, that's my question. How do you give someone the wrong information about my skin color?
During this interview, Ariva Martin used the abstract theory of privilege as the basis for a concrete assumption about David Webb. Martin's argument was that Webb could not have possibly accomplished all of the things that he had accomplished if he was black. Well, we know that's not true because David Webb is black. So what was wrong with Martin's argument? Simply put, her argument took the theory of privilege out of the abstract and applied it improperly by making an assumption about an individual. The theory of privilege states that certain characteristics make certain outcomes more probable. It does not state that certain outcomes are guaranteed, thus, this theory should not be used to make concrete predictions. Unfortunately, that's often how it is used.
You've never experienced depression in your entire life. Neither have I. You're a white male. You're a white man.
Imagine there was a study which found that red cars are more likely to end up in a traffic accident than blue cars. Based on such a study, you could argue, abstractly, that red cars are dangerous because they're more likely to end up in an accident relative to another car color. That would be fair. It would not be fair to assume that every single red car will eventually cause a crash, nor would it be fair to assume that blue cars will never crash. There are too many other variables that contribute to car accidents, and they all need to be taken into consideration. The same principle applies to privilege. Being white and/or male does not guarantee a privileged life because it is possible for a white man to be gay, poor, ugly, disabled, uneducated, medicating a mental disorder, or the product of a broken home. It's also possible for, say, a black woman to be straight, rich, beautiful, able-bodied, educated, mentally healthy, and a member of an intact family. Such a black woman would arguably be more privileged than such a white man. Even if you knew everything about another person, you'd likely find that they were a hodgepodge of fortunate and unfortunate character traits. Someone who is intelligent, but ugly. Physically healthy, but mentally unhealthy. Male, but short. In short, everybody has a relative amount of privilege. A very plain point, very well made by Tiffany Jana, founder and CEO of TMI Consulting.
The more I thought about what other people thought of me and what other people had done to me, the less I was able to believe in my full potential. And that's one of the problems with privilege. I was so fixated on the privilege that I didn't have that I missed much of the privilege that I do have. I missed the fact that being an Army brat and having international experience and being multilingual and having a great education and a mom with a PhD and a dad with an MD all gave me plenty of opportunities for success. And that's one of the traps our society lays for us. We think of privilege as something that you either have or you don't have. It's like a switch, either it's on or it's off. And if we allow ourselves to focus on the privileges that we don't have, then it's really easy for us to become blind to the ones we do have.
Once this theory has been driven all the way to its destination, we find ourselves right around where we started, with the simple fact that everyone is born into a different environment, a series of circumstances that they are not responsible for. This is, and will probably always be true, and the theory of privilege is simply a means to observe that. The best place to keep this theory appears to be in the abstract, a matter of relative probability and a means to provoke sympathy and thought, to recognize your disadvantages while at the same time making use of your advantages. What do you think? Are there any privileges that should have been listed on this bulletin board? Are any of the privileges that are on this bulletin board too conditional to really qualify as a privilege, in your opinion? Let it be known what you think about the characteristics and circumstances listed here, and which ones you think should or should not be considered privileges in the grand scheme of things. Thanks for watching. Having your attention truly was a privilege.
Keep on smiling, 'cause when you're smiling, the whole world smiles with you. The whole world smiles with you.
Well, I said it once in the video, and I'll say it again. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning into the chat. I hope you guys enjoyed that. That was one of the most difficult videos that may have ever been produced for this channel. And not just in the length of time it took to make it, but in the amount of times the head had to be banged against the wall. But now that you've seen it, and now that we're here in a live stream, let's talk about it. Let's have a discussion for let's just say about half hour, 45 minutes, maybe an hour. We'll see. Once this live stream is over, the video will be published, or just as an ordinary video. This stream will be unlisted so that it's not sitting around on the channel. The purpose of the stream is to just talk to you guys. I'm very happy to see that you guys like it. I'm looking at the chat right now. I see applauses. I see clappity. Nice vid. Was pretty good. Let's get a couple things out of the way. There was a spelling error in the video. The word assault was misspelled. Very good eye. Many more people. It wasn't just one person. Many people spotted that one, and I'm very grateful. That will be fixed. That will be corrected, and the video will be re-rendered. And when it's published, that spelling error will not exist. Thank goodness it was streamed. Some of you guys who have been subscribed to this channel for a long time know that spelling errors have wound their way into videos that were published, and that's resulted in them being pulled down and re-uploaded. So fortunately, we can prevent that from happening this time. Were there any other spelling errors in the video other than assault? And if there were, make them known. Other than that, if you guys, I'm very, very happy to see that you guys liked the video. But now let's talk. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about the points that were made, the arguments that were presented, and by all means, if there's anyone here who doesn't agree with either the premise of this video, or if you do agree with the premise but you disagree with any individual points that were made, let that be known, because we're not here to just sit around and talk about how much we like it. We're here to have an argument. So let's have some arguments here. Now, we have in the super chat a comment from Raptark, who says, I personally think young is just too relative for being either a privilege or a disadvantage. I know too many contradictory examples to label it. That seems like a fair point. Obviously, not all of the privileges that were listed on the bulletin board were granted as privileges. They weren't granted. The video didn't say all of these things are privileges. Absolutely. The point of putting the purpose of that bulletin board was to just show a dozen and a half characteristics that some people would argue are privileges, that are allegedly or arguably privileges, and whether or not they qualify as privileges in your opinion is not necessarily the point. The point is just so that we can focus on a collection of characteristics to argue over. Again, the point of all of this is to argue and to question the theory of privilege, to question whether or not the theory should be applied to certain characteristics. So that's why they were put on the bulletin board. Whether or not being young is a privilege or not, that's debatable. Here is a comment from Bork. Oh boy, I'm just going to call you Bork if you don't mind. Who says, it's almost as if intersectional collectivism loops right back around to individualism. That is correct. The point that was made at the end of the video was that if you exercise the theory of privilege fully, if you apply it completely and properly, but if you follow it through completely to its logical conclusion, it does bring you full circle, and you end up reflecting on the fact that every single, while certain characteristics may entail privileges, every single individual person is a different collection of characteristics, hence a relatively different collection of privileges. And so even if you can make an argument that being white is a privilege, or being tall is a privilege, or being rich is a privilege, or living in this country or that country is a privilege, at the end of the day, every individual is a different checklist of characteristics. And so grouping people by one or even two or three characteristics ultimately seems to crumble under the fact that everybody has their own special checklist of characteristics. So that's a good point. Here's a comment by Parker Robinson, who says, people use white privilege more to say that whiteness is a privilege in and of itself because of racism. That's a good point. A lot of people, what they mean when they use the term white privilege, what they mean is that white people don't have to put up with racism either as much or at all. And of course, the argument made in the video, there was an argument made in the video against making assumptions about individuals. For instance, it wouldn't be fair to assume that every single, not one white individual on the face of the earth, or at least in the Western world, has ever suffered at the hands of some sort of racist behavior. But as a matter of averages, that seems like a fair enough point. Kosek, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, 7 says, I'd consider including a part about potential Russian interference escalating the divide. We're really all on the same page. Okay, I'm not sure what that has to do with privilege. But there you go. It only took a few minutes before Russia was brought up. Welcome to the latter half of the 2010s. Okay, let's see here. Let's not bring up Russia again. Let's stay focused on privilege, for crying out loud. Here's a comment by Bursp. Again, if I mispronounce any of these names, I'm sorry, but it's kind of your fault for having a funny name. Fortunately, you don't have the privilege of having a name that's easy to pronounce. Bursp says, I disagree in that I think you should have touched on people hire people like them. More white people, he or she goes on to say, more white people and more men are CEOs/business owners. Wouldn't they help other whites/men? That's a good question. But the reason why it's a good question is because the answer is not simple. To assume that powerful men would only help men, or that powerful white people would only help white people, to assume that would be, well, I just said it, an assumption. Now, if you want to be empirical about that, and hopefully you do, if there is a way to produce statistics, to produce data that proves this, then we have something to talk about. If, on the other hand, we're just going to sit around and wonder or suspect that that's what happens, well, then we can't really prove it, and we're just speculating. I don't think it would be fair to assume that every powerful white person or every powerful man will only help white people or men. I mean, if that were true, then there would be no successful women, or successful black people, or brown people, or Asian people, or et cetera, et cetera. So let's try to generalize responsibly here. We when it comes to privileges, when it comes to certain characteristics resulting in you having a better likelihood of success, then it's fair to generalize. But if we're going to presume bad motives on a group of people, then that doesn't seem like a fair moment to generalize. I forgot to mention this. I meant to mention this at the beginning of the stream, guys. I'm going to mention it now. If anyone, I'm going to try to find as many good comments and questions and arguments as I can in the chat, but if anybody says anything in the super chat, you're guaranteed a reply. That only seems fair, doesn't it? Just something to keep in mind. Now, here we have another comment here by Michael Piskia. I'll call you Michael. Michael says, is it a privilege to be an American knowing your country has a dark past? Well, you could say that it's not a privilege living in a country that has a troubled history, but then again, there is an argument to be made that every country has a troubled history, and that the United States, being a relatively young country, is, by virtue of being a young country, cannot possibly have a history as ugly or as troubled as, say, the history of England or China or any nation in the Middle East. Good question. There are no simple, flat, black and white, straight answers to questions like this, and that's what makes them good, in my opinion, anyway. Here's a comment by Sarn X0. Oh boy, I'll just call you Sarn. Sarn says, the problem with the privilege argument is the diffusion of responsibility it requires. He or she goes on to say, it is like saying all white people are responsible for any white individual's racism. Well, I don't know how many people mean to imply that when they argue that there is such a thing as white privilege. I don't know how many people mean that. Of course, anybody who does mean that is not being reasonable, because it's not fair. It's just not fair to say that all white people are responsible for an individual white person's racism, any more than it's reasonable to say that all Muslims are responsible for the acts of jihadists. So if anybody means that, they're not being fair. And there are a lot of problems with the privilege debate, which was mentioned in the video. This is an extremely difficult debate to have, even though the theory itself is not that difficult to understand and it's not that controversial. It's the application of the theory that's controversial, and that's what screws a lot of the debates up. Here's a comment by 109 Rage, who says, being straight has disadvantages too, such as an example being we're not allowed to appreciate Thanks for the $20, man. Oh, brother. Here's a Connor Todd says, great job mediating a neutral ground. Well, thank you, Connor. Hopefully that is what I'm actually doing. And so if anyone thinks I am, I'm very grateful that we've got the environment right. If there's anybody here who has, I'll repeat what I said before. If there's anyone here who has, very happy to hear that you like the video, but if there's anyone here who has any questions about or criticisms of the video or any of the points that were made in it, let's hear about them. And somebody just reminded me in the chat that it's Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day to all the moms out there. All right. I'm going to look for some good arguments and some good questions in the chat. If anybody says anything in the super chat, you're guaranteed a response here. Let's see. Here's something from the control panel, who says they absolutely do make that argument, referring to something in the chat mentioned a few minutes ago. The control panel says they absolutely do make that argument. I'm taking a POLS 101 class, and the teacher has continuously claimed the existence of white individuals is what's responsible for suffering. Woo! The very fact that there are white people is why there is suffering? Well, that's very convenient. That would discount anything and everything good that white individuals do. Kind of reminds me of the I don't know if it should, but it does remind me of an argument that's made regarding the American Civil War. You've probably heard the argument made that white people were slave owners, white people fought a war to preserve slavery. Of course, that's true. It's only half true. There were white people fighting for the Union as well. There were white Americans who were fighting to abolish slavery. So it's very convenient to just take half of a picture into consideration and block out the other half. Might be more wise to take the entirety of reality into consideration. But what do I know? I'm not a college professor. Let's see here. Okay. Here's a comment by Organist, who says, "Hey, CA, do you think that the discussion of privilege changes the privilege in some ways?" That's a good question. He or she goes on to say, for example, people with privileges or people with privilege are more likely to be attacked because of their perceived privilege. Well, I don't know how much more likely it is for a privileged person to be attacked. Well, what do you mean by attacked? Because that word is overused. Do you mean physically attacked or just complained about? Verbally attacked. I don't know. I simply don't know. Needless to say, if people who were privileged were routinely beaten, then being privileged would sort of defeat the purpose of being privileged. If being privileged means you have the privilege of being attacked, then that would, I don't know what the antonym to privilege is, but that would be what it was, of course. Here's another comment by Totally Not Mark, who says, exceptional video essay. Thank you, Mark. Or excuse me, that's not who you are. Thank you, whoever you are, other than Mark. He goes on to say, perfectly put and articulated. Honestly, I feel like congratulations are in order. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Thank you, Totally Not Mark. Oh. Thank you. Here's a comment by Zachary, who says, sorry, Zachary, one moment. Let me have a drink. Down the hatch. Zachary says, 2 applications of the argument you didn't address. You spoke too soon, Totally Not Mark. Zachary says, number 1, if you have privilege, you can't sympathize with someone who doesn't have privilege. Why? I suppose Zachary is asking why that wasn't addressed. If you have a privilege, he says, if you have a privilege, you can sympathize with someone who doesn't have that privilege. Okay, can we get into semantics here? I think you have a point, Zachary, but the fact is you cannot empathize with someone who doesn't have privilege. That's a fun distinction between those two terms, sympathy and empathy. To sympathize with someone just means you feel bad for them. You recognize they're in a sorry state and you feel sorry. But if you can relate to somebody's suffering, can you empathize? Empathy is if you can relate, if you know what somebody's going through, who's going through a hard time. So technically, you can sympathize, you cannot empathize with someone who lacks a privilege if you have it. And that seems like a fair point, Zachary. But of course, that's only a fair point if somebody always had a privilege. Suppose you didn't. Suppose you didn't always have a particular privilege. Then you can empathize. You can empathize with somebody who doesn't have it. So it's conditional. It depends on it depends on your own biography, of course. If you've always been rich, you cannot empathize with someone living in poverty. You simply cannot. If you used to be poor and now you're rich, you can empathize with someone who's poor. Now, of course, whether or not you actually do is that's neither here nor there. And Zachary goes on to say, in a different comment here, number 2, this is the second application of the argument that wasn't addressed, according to Zachary says, because you have privilege, you are obligated to do/behave certain ways to compensate for that privilege. Why? Well, of course, people who are not privileged would want those who are privileged to do something to compensate for it. And that doesn't seem unreasonable on its face. It just depends on what that entails. For instance, let's focus on tall privilege, because tall privilege is a very simple example. Suppose you're tall. Well, you don't have to if you are tall, but if you're short, suppose you are tall. And you are in the room with somebody who's short and having a hard time reaching something. If you grab it, something high on the top shelf, something like that. If you are tall and you help them get it down, then that would be an example of you, whatever you call it, sharing your privilege, extending your privilege, in that case literally, but and so that seems like a fair way of quote unquote sharing or extending privilege. But of course, being tall privilege is an easy example. How you extend a white privilege or peace privilege or education privilege, I don't know. Education privilege could be easy to share too. If you're in the room with somebody who's an idiot and you know a lot of stuff, you could share it with them. Zachary, those were really good concerns you brought up, and I could go on and on and on regarding them. I can't, though, because there are other people in the chat. But I'm glad you brought them up. I guess they weren't addressed in the video, but the video was, Zachary, if you're still here and you're still listening, I hope you'll appreciate this. explanation. The reason why, yes, not every aspect of privilege was addressed in this video, and the reason why is because the video, a great effort was made to make sure that the video was focused. And that's why a lot of stuff was not mentioned. There were a lot of rabbit holes it could have fallen down. There were a lot of circles it could have ran in. But the video, a great effort was made to keep it focused, and that's why there were aspects of privilege that were simply not addressed. Jose says, is the winner of an argument correct? No, not always. Well, what do you mean by winner? How do you determine the winner of an argument? Is it the person who... you figure that out for yourself. Let's stay focused on the subject matter at hand. Before that, let's have another drink. By the way, is King Wilson here in the chat? If he isn't, that's a shame. Now, here is a comment by, where'd it go? There it is. William says, another issue is the scale people tend to apply. There are situations where privilege plays a major factor, but in general, privilege is such a minor factor in daily life. William goes on to say, turning it into this beast of an idea is over the top. Very well said. And that's an opinion that anyone who has it is entitled to. It does seem fair to say that some people, sometimes, do blow the implications of privilege out of proportion. It's obviously reasonable to say that some people are better off than others through no fault of their own. It's obviously fair to observe that some people are born into better situations and better circumstances, better environments, relative to other people. That's a fair observation, but there always will be some people who are, as the saying goes, given an inch and try to take a foot, or given a foot and try to take a mile. Yes, there are instances in which perhaps too much credit or too much sway is attributed to a person's privilege. That seems to be a common tussle between the left wing and the right wing of politics, especially American politics, because people on the left, progressives, will argue that privilege determines a lot. Privilege is a very, very, very heavy determiner of a person's fate, of whether or not a person will have a good life. Whereas those on the right, conservatives, will disagree with that. Even if they grant the notion of privilege, they won't agree to the degree to which privilege determines a person's fate. A conservative will argue, well, now look, even if there is privilege, if you work hard and if you make good decisions, you can compensate for your lack of privilege and still accomplish a happy life. And those are the 2 points of view that clash between the left and the right on the subject of privilege. That was a good point, William. Thank you. Thank you for dropping by and saying that. Now, here's a comment by Pedro, who says, I think the debate about privilege shouldn't exist. In most cases, it's basically underprivileged people begging for empathy and reason. Well, I don't agree that the debate shouldn't exist. But that's because I wouldn't argue that any debate shouldn't exist. Even if it was a debate between people who thought the earth was round and the people who thought the earth was flat. Because, as a matter of principle, I'm in favor of debates. Big surprise. I run counter-arguments. So, I don't agree with you there, Pedro. But to your point that this whole debate is people, basically underprivileged people, begging for empathy and reason? Well, I don't know. I mean, what's wrong with making people aware that some people have it harder than others? Well, it depends how far you take that. If somebody just wants to have a conversation about how some people have it harder than others, that's fine. But if somebody wants to insist that having it hard means that, if somebody argues that they have it hard, therefore they are therefore going to resent or hate people who have it better, well, then that's not fair, and that's not going to make the discourse any better off. Now, here's a question by Epic Man, who says, would you consider someone with a large social media following privileged? They're able to extend influence over a lot of people. Well, Epic Man, that's a good question. Of course, if you saw the video, and I know you did because I saw you in the chat room during it while I was playing, it was argued that a privilege, according to the theory, a privilege is a characteristic that grants unearned advantages. And if somebody has a large social media following, chances are they did earn it by creating a platform or by creating, in this case, a YouTube channel. But that's not always the case. That's not always the case. Some people were guaranteed an audience by virtue of being on a TV show or having a famous parent, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, Will Smith's children didn't earn their social media following. Neither did a lot of the Kardashians. So it depends. It's conditional. It depends on each individual circumstances. Good question, all the same. Thank you, Universal Angel. Thank you, Rocky Henry. Now, let's keep this stream going it's been going, or let's see, the Q&A now, or the discussion, has been going now for about a half an hour. Let's keep it going for at least another 15 minutes. Maybe more, maybe 20 or 25, we'll see. I'll keep an eye out for as many good arguments or questions in the chat as I can. Once again, if anybody comments in the super chat, you're guaranteed a reply. Now, here's a question from Neil. Let's have another drink. Neil says, does trying to correct privilege cause privilege? For example, affirmative action. He goes on to say, so is the discussion of privilege. Does the discussion of privilege cause privilege to change? Affirmative action can also be argued to cause more white people, and then that's where he stopped. Okay, so Neil asks, does trying to correct privilege cause privilege? And of course, affirmative action is probably one of the best examples, just because it's such a familiar example. If a system is put in place that makes it relatively easier for someone who's black to get into a college, then that certainly does. Well, I don't know. This is kind of semantics again. Does that create black privilege, or does that just reduce white privilege? Or does reducing white privilege inherently create black privilege? Because the whole point of reducing the privilege of some is to make everybody on an even playing field and eliminate the existence of privilege in the first place. I don't know. That's quite a philosophical word salad, frankly, the way I was stringing all that together. I frankly don't know. I mean, language can kind of go awry when we're talking about a concept as abstract as privilege. You know, if we have affirmative action, does that quote-unquote create black privilege? Does that quote-unquote diminish white privilege? Does that quote-unquote reduce privilege in general? You know, language, this is a very abstract concept, and so you have to be careful the way you string a sentence together and trying to make heads or tails of it. Good question. Zachary, again. Hey, Zach. Zachary says, I think the debate I'm going to reword what you said, Zach. I don't think the debate should be, does privilege exist? Instead, I think it should be, can action be compelled or denied on the basis of privilege? Did you mean can or should? Should action be compelled or denied on the basis of privilege? Well, I'll just go with the way you worded it. Well, Zachary, if you don't think the debate should be about whether or not privilege exists, frankly, that's just too bad, because that's the debate that's taking place. There are still that's the current state of the debate. Now, will we graduate beyond that in the years to come? It's possible. It's likely. For instance, regarding the global warming debate, the global warming debate used to be primarily, is it happening or not? And over the decades, it's graduated to this point now where most people having the debate acknowledge that global warming is taking place, and the debate is over what should be done about it, if anything. So the privilege debate might graduate beyond, does it exist in the years to come? Or how does it exist? And when that happens, it might move towards what you say, Zachary. Can action be compelled or denied on the basis of privilege? We'll have to see. But currently, we're still stuck on, does it exist or not? You know, the privilege debate has been so mishandled, and interactions with people who are trying to talk about it are bungled so frequently that we are currently stuck on whether or not it even exists, or whether or not what the hell it even is. So many debates about privilege go down the toilet. A lot of people don't even know precisely what it is. So that it has a ways to go. This debate certainly has a ways to go. Susan says, to be honest, it's kind of hard to come up with criticism of the video and its arguments with just one viewing of it and with no reviewing opportunities. Fair point, Susan. That's a fair point. Of course, if you have anything to say about it whatsoever, it would be appreciated. But I understand that. I understand that after watching a 22-minute long video once, it's not fair to expect somebody to be able to have a complete review of it, or to be able to consider all of it at once. So that's a good point, Susan. That's a good point. I still think this is worthwhile. I did want to get people's initial reactions, but it's a fair point to say that we're going to have to wait. It's going to take the video being published, which it will. Some people have been asking if this video is going to be published after the stream. It will. It will. This was just a way of sort of unveiling it and talking about it afterwards. Premiering it, if you will. Let's not call it that. This video will be published as an ordinary video shortly after this stream. And only then, when a person can watch it over and over and over again and have hours, if not days, to consider it in its entirety, yes, only then can somebody provide a complete review, a complete response to it. It's too much to ask for that in this stream, naturally. Thanks for stopping by, Susan, all the same. Glad you're here. Rocky Henry says, or asks, are you going to make part 2 on this subject? No, that's not in the works. The goal with this particular project, the goal with this video about privilege, was not to make a series. It was just to make one piece of content that hopefully cleared up any misunderstandings or misapprehensions about the concept, explained it, applied it to a handful of characteristics, talked about the merits of the theory, the faults of the discussion. There isn't going to be a part 2. An effort was made to make sure that this one video addressed everything, the most important things, everything that needed to be addressed about the topic. Now, does that mean a part 2 will never be made? No. Who knows? Maybe there will be a part 2 made to this video, and maybe the person who makes that part 2 is not me, but a guest, some other YouTuber who presents an argument on privilege that's published on this channel. Who knows? Now, Chamberlain? Can I get away with calling you Lily? I hope so. Lily says, if it isn't too much to ask for, would you mind addressing the cisgender privilege? And what do you think about this new way of working on a video? Well, that's 2 questions, and I'll answer them in order. The argument, from what I've heard and from what I've read, the reason why being cisgender is a privilege, which for those who don't know, being cisgender means you identify with the sex that you were born as. I've heard it and read it I've heard and read the argument that being cisgender is a privilege simply because people who are trans are on average, getting back to averages, on average more likely to suffer from depression or to commit suicide. Basically, a person who is not cisgender is more likely to live an unhappy life. And so by that metric, you could argue that it's a privilege. Now, of course, if you don't agree with that metric, then you wouldn't think being cisgender is a privilege in the first place, but that's the idea. That's a very, very simple version of the idea. I'm sure someone else could say a lot more about it than that. And to your second question, Lily, what do you think about this new way of working on a video? Well, evidently I like it because I'm doing it. I thought it would be a good idea. It's turning out to be a good idea. Somebody found a spelling error. It's a chance to chat with you guys, to sort of get the perspective of others, which fills me with a newfound sense of confidence when I finally do publish this video, that a lot of other people have looked it over and given their 2 cents. I like this new way of working on a video, and I plan to do this with all the videos that are published on the channel in the future. So look out, because there's going to be more of this. From now on, every single time I make a video, I'm going to schedule a live stream, stream it, and then talk about it. Even if nothing is accomplished, even if no flaws are pointed out, no spelling errors are found, no critiques are given, even if there was no apparent point in streaming a video, it's just fun. It's just fun talking to you guys. It's just fun having a conversation with the people who are subscribed to the channel, and to just entertain these ideas. I kind of sounded like Ruben there, didn't I, for a second? It's fun to talk about ideas in honest conversation. Okay, that's enough of that. Now, Universal Angel says, privilege is just the perception of someone's disadvantage projecting onto someone else. Well, Universal Angel, that's not... I don't think it's fair to say that that's all it is. And I don't think it's fair to say that that's what everybody who's disadvantaged does. I'm sure there are some people who lack privilege who think that way and feel that way, but not all of them. And I don't think that's... I think that's just a oversimplification of the theory. The theory of privilege really is fascinating. And personally, I think it does have merit, so I don't think it's fair to boil it down to just that. Let's see here. We have, next, Bloodhawk, who says, will you keep doing streams like this? You should. Oh, well, Bloodhawk, I believe I've already answered your question while talking to Lily just a few minutes ago. Good question all the same, though. Yes. Yes, streams like this will happen. Arguments that are completed for the channel will be streamed. If for no other reason, just because it's a lot of fun to do so. Now, here's a question from Vitz, V-I-T-Z, who says, if perceived privileges are based upon stereotypes, can those... hang on a second. Hang on. If perceived privileges are based on stereotypes... but they're not. Well, not always. A lot of privileges are based on data. They're based on averages. You know? For instance, I mean, in the video, there were a couple of graphs. There were a half a dozen graphs that were produced to show how white people, on average, are less likely to live in poverty and have an education, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's empirical. We were talking earlier about tall privilege, about how a tall person is fortunate in that they're able to reach stuff that's hard to reach. But of course, they're not privileged when trying to ride on a bus or an airplane. So privileges are not based on stereotypes necessarily. A lot of times they're based on either data or obvious personal experiences, like tall people banging their heads. But nevertheless, Vitz says, if perceived privileges are based upon stereotypes, can those privileges morally be removed or granted based upon stereotypes? Well, that's a good question, but unfortunately for you, I don't really agree with the way you set the question up in the first place. I don't think privileges are based on stereotypes. If somebody does base them on stereotypes, I don't think that's reasonable, and they shouldn't do that in the first place. So while I'm not answering your question, I have hopefully provided a reason why. Hopefully. Whitney says, or asks, can we possibly distinguish which faults/imperfections are quote-unquote our fault and which are not? Nice vid, by the way. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you. Good question. Can we possibly distinguish which faults or imperfections are quote-unquote our fault? Well, I'm not... Do I even know what you mean by our fault? What do you mean by that? darn it, Whitney, that's a good question, but unfortunately, I don't know for certain what you mean, and I don't want to assume to know what you mean. I don't want to read something into the question you didn't want to put there. Like, I'm sorry, I'm not sure I know what you mean. Can we distinguish between which faults are our fault and which ones are not? Well, I don't. Okay, what would be an example of a fault or imperfection being somebody's fault? If somebody's fat because they just have a poor diet and they don't exercise, versus somebody whose genetics just make them large. Okay, well, here's my attempt to answer your question. If you are responsible for a fault, well, that's just redundant. Obviously, if you're responsible for a fault or an imperfection, it would be your fault. And if not, if one of your faults is the result of genetics or the state of the country you live in, or what sort of environment or neighborhood you were born into, then it's not your fault. I hope that answers your question. That was one of the. I'm sorry if the question really was simple and I made it more complicated in my head. I'm sorry if that's the case. I don't think I really understood that entirely. But thanks for stopping by, Whitney. Now, next up, there are some really good comments here. It's a shame I cannot read these all. I mean, I could, but then there'd be many more, and I wouldn't be able to read them either. I don't want to. It seems really pompous to brag and say something like the people who are subscribed to this channel have very thoughtful and well-worded things to say compared to most other channels. That's an arrogant thing to say, but frankly, that's how I feel, so the least I can say is that I'm being honest. Now, next up we have a comment from Marty, who says, how often do you think check your privilege, the phrase check your privilege, is a bad faith way of dismissing your opponent's argument without properly addressing them? Love the stream. Thanks, Marty. How often? Well, frankly, I don't know. To give your question the proper answer, I don't know how often the phrase check your privilege is used in bad faith. Obviously, if it is used in bad faith, that's not good. I'd like to think there are some people who don't say that in bad faith. I would like to think that some people out there who do say that, who say to somebody, check your privilege, that what they mean by that is an honest to goodness way of saying, hey, take a moment and reflect on how good your life is and, how fortunate you are. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but there's something characteristically snarky about saying check your privilege. Why not just tell someone be grateful for what you have? That's another way of saying check your privilege, and it's a much more warm way of saying it. Yeah, obviously, sometimes when some people say check your privilege just to shut somebody up, and that's no good. As a matter of principle, that's just not an ethical thing to do. Even if you think it has merit, even if you are someone who lacks a lot of privileges and you are staring in the eye someone who has a lot of privilege, do you want to build a bridge or not? Do you want to get along with people or not? Maybe you don't. Maybe you like alienating people. Who knows? I certainly don't. Okay, here's something said by... Oh, crap, I lost it. Where did it go? Oh, Neil. Neil's saying, can someone in the chat answer my question? Please. What's your question, Neil? Did you say something in the super chat and it was missed? Oh, crap. I did miss something in the super chat. Jose said, Jose says, like many in the chat ask, can privilege be quantified? Intersectionality seems to miss this. People go blank when asked how a fix ought to be applied. Good question, Jose. This was not addressed in the video because it just didn't seem something worthy of getting hung up on in the video, but let's entertain this question now. Can privilege be quantified? It doesn't seem possible. Now, just because I don't know how that could be done doesn't mean it can't be done, but I simply don't know where on earth you would start. How to quantify, how to write down on a piece of paper a series of numbers, a series of figures to measure the amount of privilege somebody has. I don't think that's possible. And I would remind everyone who saw the video that the argument that was made in the video was that privilege it's a theory, it's an abstract concept. It's a matter of relative probability. It's fair to say, it seems fair to say that if you're born with this characteristic or that characteristic, you are statistically more likely to end up with a happy life. And so I guess that's as close as you could get to quantifying privilege. Like if you find a graph that says this percentage of white people live out of poverty and this percentage of black people live in poverty, then I guess you could use that as a way of quote-unquote quantifying privilege, but that would just be one aspect of that particular privilege. So it doesn't seem possible, and it doesn't seem like it really needs to be done, because if you accept that privilege is an abstract concept, it's an abstract way of observing how some people have it harder than others, then it's not necessary to quantify it. And thank goodness, because it just doesn't seem possible to do in the first place. Unless I'm missing something. Unless it actually is possible, and I'm not sure how it is. Okay, we're going to keep the stream going now for another 5 or 10 minutes, and then we're going to wrap it up. I just want you guys to know that I'm reading a lot of what's in the chat, and that I'm not saying out loud. I am reading some of these arguments and some of these questions. I'm not saying them out loud because it's just not possible to say them all. But I am keeping an eye on a lot of this stuff. And a lot of it is well said. Wyatt, hang on, let's have a drink. Wyatt says, I think it would be helpful to compare the concept of privilege to the Christian concept of blessings and statistical generalizations, which can in the same way without many of the flaws of privilege. Okay. Wyatt thinks it would be helpful to compare the theory of privilege to the Christian concept of blessings. Something to think about. Something that I'm currently thinking about. Thanks for stopping in, Wyatt. Marty again says, oops, I already read that one. Sorry, I guess there were a couple of comments in the super chat that I missed. And yeah, now here's a comment of Wyatt saying, dude, you ignored my super chat. You're right, Wyatt. That was my bad. I scrolled over a couple of comments in the super chat, and that was my mistake. I did say that if you comment in the super chat, you're guaranteed a reply. Damn it if I'm not a man of my word. I think I've got them all now. Here's someone going by the name of Pops says, I have counter-arguments privilege. I get to hear good arguments. Aw, thank you. Thank you, Pops. Here's Vitz again, V-I-T-Z. Vitz says, basically Vitz is rewording his comment from earlier. Vitz says, if privileges are based upon viewed characteristics and data, may those privileges justly be removed or granted based upon viewed characteristics and data when we're all individuals. That's worded much better that way, Vitz. May those privileges justly be removed or granted based upon the characteristics when we're all individuals. Yeah, that would seem to be fair as long as you kept in mind that we are all ultimately individuals. Because the theory of privilege requires generalizations. It is inherently a series of generalizations, observing that certain people born a certain way are likely to end up better off than others. You know, that's very broad. And so as long as you keep it in the back of your, it seems like if you just keep it in the back of your mind that every individual is an individual, and every individual is their own unique collection of characteristics and privileges, then yeah, it would seem to be reasonable to do as you say of it. But I wonder, I hadn't really thought about that before, so I wonder if there's anyone else in the chat who has something to say about that. Maybe it's not reasonable. Maybe I'm missing something here. But thanks for rewording that, Fitz. Thank you very much. I appreciated that. Oh boy. You guys are certainly getting in a good amount of chats in the super chat with Only Truth. We are going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes or so. Let's see. Next up we have Angry Mango. Why is that funny? Angry Mango says, the advantages of being white were all other listed privileges. For example, wealth and education. So doesn't that mean white privilege is redundant? Good question, Angry Mango. Good question. What I'm about to say almost made it into the video. It was cut, but it almost made it in. And that is that apparently, white privilege simply means that you're more likely to have privilege. So yeah, you could argue that it is redundant. The fact of the matter is that on average, a white person in America, in the United States, is on average more likely to have other privileges. So it's kind of like coupling multiple train cars together and forming a train of logic. It's not necessarily that being white means that you're going to levitate and be happy and good looking and all that. It's that if you're white, you're more likely. White privilege means you're more likely to have wealth privilege. Having white privilege means you're more likely to have education privilege. Having white privilege means you're more likely to. You're probably more likely to have American privilege or more likely to have Western world privilege, because I think most white people on the planet live in the Western world, although I don't know that for certain. So yeah, good point, Angry Mango. You could argue it's redundant, but as long as it all connects together and it all makes sense, then there's no problem. It's just a funny way of looking at it. John Smith says, you wait a second, let's have another drink. Thank goodness I have this drink here. My throat is dry at the moment. Talking a lot will do that, of course. John Smith says, would you be willing to host / participate in a debate regarding privilege? Also, he goes on to say, would you join me on a podcast regarding privilege? Well, I have to think about that. But to your first question, would I be willing to host or participate in a debate about privilege? That sounds worthwhile. And so, yeah, it would depend on where it was. It would depend on who was participating. We would have to agree on the terms and conditions of the debate. But the idea, I like. So thanks for asking that, John. Lily Chamberlain. Oh, my goodness. Did you change your name to Lily? Are you the same person before who? That's outstanding. Yeah, Lily is my typical nickname. All right, Lily. I'm glad I was not unfair in assuming that would be a fair nickname for you. Lily says, yeah, Lily is my typical nickname. Virtually nobody says Lillian. I probably didn't say that right at all. Also, Lily says, I love your reference to Big Ideas guy, Dave Rubin. My opinion, this is Lily's opinion, not mine. In Lily's opinion, he's dumb. There you go. Somebody thinks Dave Rubin is a dummy. Stop the presses. Well, hey, Lily, glad that you came back and let me know that was a fair nickname for you. And glad that you appreciated a reference. You see what I said earlier? I said it earlier, I'll say it again. These streams are fun. I always have a good time. Even if there aren't so many productive comments, and even if nothing feels like it's accomplished, at the very least, these streams are just fun. Alan Tear, thank you very much for that. Oh, and Lily says again, sorry for that derailing of the conversation. It's okay. It's all right, Lily. Okay, we'll take a few more comments and then we'll call it a day. We'll call it a Mother's Day. David says, I love that you don't base arguments on left/right bias. Well, David, you're welcome. I don't like arguments. I don't always like arguments that are sort of pigeonholed to the left or the right. And so I try to keep that from happening on in my own house. I'm glad you appreciate it. All right. Well, hey there, Universal Angel. I personally enjoyed this very much. Practically every single person who, John Smith says he put his email in the comments. Love the show. Well, thank you, John. I'll check that out. Unvitz says, how should the scope of privilege management be limited? Does it stop at individuals, companies, nations? Oh my God, Vitz, that is a really good question. I don't know how to answer it. Ah, crap. I really don't, Vitz, look, that was a good question, man, but I don't know. I really don't know where it stops. I don't know how the scope of privilege management should be limited. I know that's my answer. I know it's not a good answer because I don't know is kind of a nothing burger of an answer. But that's my honest answer. Here's someone who says, I missed a super chat about Oprah. Oh, crap. Let's go back up and find it. Did somebody say something about Oprah in the super chat? I hope I didn't. Well, I certainly hope I didn't miss anything. Oh, here it is. Universal Angel. I'm sorry. God, YouTube needs to... I like what YouTube has done with these chats for the most part, but they do need to find a way to... I don't know. Find a better way of organizing the super chat comments, because I always seem to miss one. Universal Angel says, do you have white or male privilege compared to Oprah? What? Do you have white or male privilege compared to Oprah? Well, yeah, but Oprah's rich and famous. So, I don't know. What are you asking? Is Oprah more... Are you asking if Oprah's more privileged than your average white man? If so, yeah, that seems fair to say. But if anybody disagrees with that, we can argue over it. God, I did miss that comment. Thank you for pointing that out, whoever did. Thanks for letting me know that I missed that one. Vitz says, I don't know is perfectly acceptable. Well, thank you, Vitz. Hey, man, that's what you get when you ask a really good question like that. Sometimes it's just hard to cook up a good answer on the spot. Wyatt says, Dave Rubin is my favorite gay. There you go. I enjoyed this. For the most part, we had fun. Not for the most part, entirely. This was a lot of fun. And I enjoyed myself, even though not all of the comments, very few comments were unfocused. Most of the comments in this stream were focused on the topic. Most of them were well written. Most of them asked good questions or provided very interesting perspectives and gave it and made this whole stream very worthwhile. Guys, I'm going to say again what I said when this stream started. This was special because this hasn't happened before. Hopefully this does, well, not hopefully, this will be routine. From now on, arguments that are produced for the channel will be streamed and you will have the chance to see them before they're published and to have a chat about them and give your opinion on them, whether or not you agree with them, disagree with them, whether or not you think they're reasonable, or whether or not they contain any spelling errors. That's going to be routine, but I'll say it again. This was the first time that this has happened. And I personally was very excited to stream an argument on this channel for the first time and to immediately talk about it with you guys afterwards. So this really does mean a lot. And I'm very glad that you participated and that virtually everybody had something worthwhile to say. So this is where we end the stream. Happy Mother's Day to everybody. Happy Sunday. My apologies to everybody who lives across the pond for this stream happening very, 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 very late in the day. So late that it's tomorrow morning for you. Nevertheless, I'm happy that everyone, whether you were on this side of the pond or the other side of the pond, I'm glad that for everyone who was able to tune in that you were able to stop by. And I hope you get used to this because there's going to be more of this. There are going to be more streams on this channel and more discussions with you guys about the content that is produced for this channel. So thank you one more time, guys. Thank you for tuning in. Thanks for watching, and thank you for contributing in the chat with thought and with humor. Take care of yourselves. Take care of everyone else around you. And I'll see you guys in the next stream in the very near future. Good night, everybody. Take care.